This week, we're going to be talking about homophony. And what that means is really chords following chords following chords. We won't have a bass and an accompaniment and a melody. We'll have melody, we'll have a bass voice, but we'll just be working with chords following chords and following chords. Now that we're familiar with the chords that we find in classical music, we need to talk about two things. One is, how do we voice those chords? So where do we put the root and the third, and how far away can they be from each other? Okay, these are important questions to ask because they also define the style of a music. The second is, how do we move from one chord to the next chord? And that we call voice leading. We'll talk about that in a future video. But in this one, let's deal specifically with voicing. Well, of course, a lot of classical music was, in the early days, was written for voice. And so the idea of voicing comes out of actual singing and voices making music. Which means that a lot of the things about voicing are determined by voices. And of course, we have to talk about vocal range when we talk about voices. So, when we write a chord, and we're going to be working with 4 voices at the same time, we're going to always be working with soprano, alto, tenor, and bass voices. One note for each vocal part. And so what we have here are the ranges. Soprano range, we see. Soprano is this middle C up a little bit more than a 12th above that. Alto starts a 4th below that, etc., etc. Always reference this when you're doing any kind of homophonic writing or writing, four-part writing for voices. So we see, if we look at the largest range, that we can go more or less from this E in the bass to this A in the soprano. And we want to fit voices, all 4 voices, inside of that range. Okay, so let's talk about voicing of a chord. Well, first I should say that there are 2 kinds of voicing. There's what we call open structure, and the other we call closed structure. So what's the difference? First, open. Well, this is an example of an open structure. And if we look at it, if we look at the intervals between the voices, we see an octave, a 5th, and a 6th. Now, if we look at just the top 3 voices, we see a 5th here and a 6th here. We see that these 3 voices need more than an octave. They fit more than a 1 octave space. And when that's the case, we say that it's an open structure. It's important to note that within these 3 voices, we don't see an interval larger than an octave. That's going to be important later on. We see a 5th and we see a 6th. Well, then what's closed structure? Closed structure is simply when these top 3 voices fit in the span of less than 1 octave. So here we have a 3rd and a 4th, and the total span is about a 6th. Not about, it is. It's a minor 6th. Okay, so if we see this kind of construction, then we say that it's closed structure. When should you use open structure? When should you use closed structure? That's really an artistic decision. Generally, they say if you start open structure, you stay open structure for at least the length of the phrase. If you start closed structure, you stay closed structure. That's probably a good bit of advice to follow, but I wouldn't stay too strictly with that. If the sound if the sound you're after requires you to switch from closed structure to open structure, or vice versa, then you should do that. Okay, now, just as a little bit of practice, take a look at this one here. Take a second to determine whether or not it's open structure or closed structure, and then continue on. Okay, so I hope you took a look at this and you said, well, if I look at the intervals, I see I have a 6th between these intervals, and I have a 6th here, so that's definitely more than an octave, which means we definitely have an open structure chord. And that's the case. Okay, let's move on and talk about things to avoid. Well, there are probably many things to avoid, but let's look at two very important ones. Put down here that this is a sin. Why? It's a sin. You should avoid it. Well, if we look, as I said before, when we looked at the top three voices in the previous examples, we saw that, well, you could have a fifth or a sixth between two voices, but you never went more than an octave. Okay, that you should stick to. You should never have more than an octave between voices that are adjacent. So between soprano and alto, or alto and tenor. Okay? Avoid a gap of more than one octave between adjacent voices. Well, why is this? So it's one thing is to follow a rule. It's another thing to understand it. So why would they say don't do this? Okay, we get inside the thinking of a classical composer. Well, the sonority, this is as far as the classical composer is concerned, the sonority is jeopardized. The unity of this thing as a chord, as a single sounding entity, is put in jeopardy when in your upper three voices they're too far apart. And actually it would be the case here. These things we'd hear as one part, and these two we'd hear as something else. To get them to blend and come together, we'd follow this rule of thumb that says in the upper three voices, avoid gaps larger than an octave between adjacent voices. Okay, so let's say you saw this in an example. Would this be a sin? Is this an example of the sin we just talked about? The answer is no, actually. This is not something you should avoid. Let's talk about why. Well, between the bass and the tenor voices, you can have larger intervals than an octave. It's very common to find a tenth. It's fairly common to find a twelfth. Larger than that, you might find, but pretty rarely. So this is what I'd like to suggest. Any interval up to approximately a twelfth is fine between the tenor and the bass. If you get to a tenth, that's usually large enough of an interval between the lower two voices. You can push it a little bit farther and go to a twelfth. But I would say if you're at a tenth, if you can keep it at a tenth or less, good. If you need to go to a twelfth or something like that, it's okay. But try to get back to a tenth or an octave as soon as you possibly can. Okay, here's our final, or the second sin we should watch out for. Now this looks okay, right? I mean, it looks, we've got four voices and the interval between them doesn't look any larger than an octave. So it should be okay, right? Well, but let's look. Where's the lowest of these top three? Where's the lowest note? Well, the lowest note isn't in the tenor, as it is in all the other examples we've seen. It's in the alto. And when this happens, when a voice that's higher in register than the other goes lower than the other voice, we call it voice crossing. So this is something that you'd want to avoid. Now, you can very easily find examples of voice crossing in the repertoire, but it's a good rule of thumb to follow. In general, you avoid voice crossing. Okay, so why? Why should we avoid voice crossing? Here's how a classical composer would probably answer. They probably say that the independence of each voice is jeopardized. And I think this is kind of interesting because if we look at this first one, they're all worried about sonority, right? They're all worried about this thing sounding like a thing. And at the same time, if we look at this, it almost seems like a contradictory answer, yeah? Well, you're worried about independence while you're worried about unity. Okay, this is the case, that on one hand, you want to work to create sonorities. On the other hand, you want to make sure that each of the individual voices can be heard and followed. And when you get this voice crossing, it's hard to tell, is this now the tenor note or is it the alto note? So in general, please follow these two rules of thumb and understand where they come from. A desire to create something sonorous and at the same time the desire to have four things be independent of each other. Okay, now one question that is very reasonable will come up the minute you start doing any kind of voicings of chords or voice leading is, okay, if I'm working with a triad, I've got 3 notes, you're telling me I have 4 voices. So what happens? Does one person not sing, or do I double a note? And if so, what note should I double? So at this stage, we're working only with root position chords, or we will be working with only root position chords this week. In that case, double the root. So here's a nice example. It's a very common kind of voicing of a major triad. Root, root, 5th, and 3rd. So 2 voices are on the root, 1 voice on the 5th, 1 voice on the 3rd. Okay, so now what happens with a 7th chord? A 7th chord, if you've got all 4 notes, then 1 note has to be in each voice. So here's an example. We just have the root, go up here, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. However, it's very common with 7th chords that you drop a note. Now, which one do we drop? We drop the 5th, omit the 5th. Why? Okay, let's talk about these notes. What does the root give us? The root tells us what the function of the chord is, right? Or at least what the inversion of the chord is. The root tells us a lot about the chord. The 3rd also tells us a lot about the chord. It tells us whether it's major or minor, which, as we saw earlier, can decide whether or not this is a minor 7th chord or a dominant 7th chord. And if it's a dominant 7th chord, it functions differently. So we need to have the 3rd because it gives us a lot of information about the chord. It's very important in classical music whether or not the chord is major or minor, especially with a 7th chord. And of course we need the 7th because otherwise we just have a triad, right? So if you're only using 3 notes of a dominant 7th chord, please omit the 5th.